Hey everybody, and welcome to another work in progress series. This is covering my rather large Halo Ground Command project. And if you've never watched one of my work in progress video series, the idea here is basically to provide kind of an overview, sort of an ongoing vlog of my progress on a particular project. And while I don't focus on doing specific tutorials necessarily, it's more about observations, and I will sometimes kind of dive in a little deeper on some specific aspect of the project. But to start with, I'm just about finished with assembly, so this is kind of the prologue to the project. And I had some thoughts on the minis, and to be honest, this is actually my second take. I recorded this yesterday initially, or I should just say a day ago, because I don't know when you're watching this. But I felt like I was feeling particularly salty, and I don't know that the video would necessarily have been that interesting and or entertaining or informative to watch when I was in that kind of mood. So I thought I would take another shot at it, and I can explain my saltiness having taken a step back. And I had actually recorded about halfway through the day after having to deal with some of the issues, and was sort of in the middle of the pain of those issues. But let's go with those issues. Let's talk about those issues so that you know what I'm referring to here, and that is the metal minis. The metal mini, the masters for these were obviously all exceptionally cool. I like how all of the minis look. They're really neat. The problem is, and this gets into a bigger thing that I want to talk about, but let me just talk about the issue. And that is the molds. And I don't know, I can't tell you exactly what is causing the problems with the molds, but the molds have problems. And specifically, when I started out, I did the Marines first, and there was a lot of problems, and I'm actually not seeing it on these guys, so these guys are not a good example. But actually, I might have some video from yesterday that I might be able to use. But let me just talk about the issue here, and that is that in these areas of the mold here, the molds are breaking. And what happens when a mold breaks and you lose a piece of the mold is that every subsequent casting from that mold fills in that void with metal. And so you've got a huge blob of metal, say for example, entirely encompassing this area here. And so I find myself having to go in with first with drill bits to sort of give myself a place to start, and then I've been using my Dremel, and specifically this tool, to widen out that area and try to make it less objectionable. And it's a real pain. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to do on an ostensibly 15mm mini, and I'll actually come back to that later as well. So yeah, the Marines were kind of tough, and then I got to the Grunts, and the Grunts have some similar issues, but the really bad ones were these fuel rod cannons, and I've already cleaned these up, but the fuel rod cannons have, almost all of them had this sort of extra bit of metal coming off of them, off of the top. And so, I mean, I was back to using this tool to grind away at that metal to bring it back down to the basic shape that the fuel rod cannon should be. And that was not a simple process, and super time consuming and really problematic. And on top of that, I feel like I'm already getting back to my saltiness of yesterday. I'm gonna try and project a measure of calm here. So on top of that, I saw some other issues where the surface was not as smooth as it could be, and I used to do, or I have done. I don't want to make this out to be more than it is, but I have done metal casting myself. Way back in the day, and this would be the early 90s, I worked for a time with Leading Edge Games. Some of you might remember them from doing the Terminator and Alien games and having some miniature lines back then. I actually got a chance to do some casting, and I also know something about mold making, but that is not something I've ever done, but I have seen it done, so I understand the process. And I know that some of the issues that I'm seeing with the surfaces not being as smooth as they could be are usually temperature issues. And I can't recall if it's too high or too low a temperature. I think it's too high a temperature. And it creates a surface that almost looks like it has bubbles, but I don't think that's even correct. It's just the metal isn't smooth. And so I'm seeing that a lot. Especially on the fuel rod cannon guys and in a few other places. And the elites. The elites, I saw that a lot on the elites. So mold makers, especially for metal minis, but really in any casting situation, mold makers are can be or generally are the unsung heroes of the industry, because if a mold is done well, nobody notices, really, because there's no problems, and that's what you want. You want no problems, a minimum of parting lines, a minimum of flash, and when it's done well, you're like, wow, this is a beautiful mini, and you don't even think about the fact that somebody had to create that mold and make it awesome. But when a mold is not done well, and you have issues and problems, well, that's when you notice, and that's when you start thinking about mold makers. And, I think there's a lot of detail. There's clearly a lot of detail on the minis. And I don't know if they were just trying to do too much with the minis. And if that's the case, that's something the mold maker should have said, hey, we need to step back here and rethink how we're approaching these. And I can't look at the minis and tell you if that's necessarily the issue. I don't necessarily think it is, but it could be. And then if it's not that, though, then it just comes down to the mold maker himself and whether or not he's good at his craft. And it could be a couple of things aside from that, and it could be that they're trying to get too much out of the molds, and that the molds are breaking down, and that I'm seeing molds that are at their end of their useful life and have probably gone beyond their useful life, but they're doing them anyway without making more to save on costs. All of these things are possible. I don't know with any certainty what any of them, what the actual reasons are. All I know from my end is that it's more work for me to try to make these as good as they can be. On the other hand, the resin bits are all beautiful. I have only seen one kind of serious miscast area, and it was in an area that would not be visible when the model was assembled. So that's not something I'm worried about. But otherwise, the resins are quite beautiful, very detailed, very well cast, and a joy, really. Actually, let me show you. because in addition to the war game minis, I'm also doing some of the large ones, some of the larger minis, display minis. And this is the Elite. And look at how clean that is. Look at how nice and smooth. And I haven't done any cleanup on this yet. This is really just pulled straight from the bag. I pulled it from the bag yesterday when I did my salty version of this. There's a little parting line there. And you can see it kind of travels a bit, but it's so light, right? I'm looking at very little in the way of issues in correcting that. Like, this is, not only is this to be expected, this is probably better than expected. This is really nice. Let's look at the Marine. I've got a Marine here as well. There's a parting line there. And there. This one's actually a little bit heavier than on the Elite, but again, not anything more than you might expect on a resin casted piece. And certainly easily cleaned up. Yep. So that's nice. Yeah, you can see it kind of goes under there. Oh, that's a little surprising. Maybe not. I would have expected the parting line to be right down the center here, but it actually goes up underneath the arm there. Oh, and there's a little void. There's a little air bubble right there. That's not a problem. So anyway, very, very happy with the larger pieces and the resin models in general. There's a ghost piece, the front piece. I actually have some assembled ones somewhere. Well, actually partially assembled because of the way that these go together, like so. It's certainly going to be easier to keep them apart until they're painted and then put them together. Because otherwise, how do you paint his head? You don't. So that's going to be how I approach those. Now I have, I'm about 9. Well, I think the only thing I have left to assemble are the ghosts, or the last 3 ghosts. I have 2 sets of ghosts, 2 sets of 3. And once those are assembled, I move on to, I have to do some filling around the bases. And I'm going to use, I don't have it handy, but I'm going to use some Vallejo texture putty. I've got a big tub of that, and I'll dab it around there and then spread it a little bit around the rest of the base so that we have sort of consistent coverage, and it doesn't just look like, hey, why are the areas right around 1 foot a little bit different from everything else. And there'd be another way to approach painting these, and that would be, and I almost did this, and that would be to set them all up on like popsicle sticks in a line. And in fact, I started doing that. My very first base full of minis I put out on the sticks, and then I realized that I wasn't entirely sure that it was going to be easy to figure out who went on what base later. So I decided to go ahead and just put them on their bases. That also mitigates another problem, which is handling the mini while it's painted, and especially with many metal minis, the more you handle the actual model, the more you're risking the possibility of chipping the paint, which I don't want to do. But actually, I'm going to be using Mr. Surfacer on this, and I think that's a primer that's supposed to mitigate that a lot. And I'm kind of excited. My my customer wanted to use it, so he sent me a can of it to use. And although I've been aware of that stuff for years, the very first hobby store that I worked at in the 1980s carried it, but I never used any of their stuff. So this will be a new experience for me, and I can share that with you. And in fact, I might do that a little later. And with that in mind, I think I'm going to go ahead and stop for the moment here, and then I'll come back a little while, and perhaps I've become more salty or less, or I don't know, we'll see where I am. But yeah, we're going to continue this project, so I'll see you momentarily. Oh, I'm back, and this is actually just moments later for myself. I thought of something that I was going to come back to, and I didn't, and that is, what scale are these? Miniature scales are kind of all over the place. You know, one man's 28 millimeters, another man's 30 millimeter. But these are supposed to be 15 millimeter scale minis. And I just want to show you that, so the big heavy line between the 1 and the 2, that is 15 millimeter. That is at his shoulder blades, or really his shoulders, top of his shoulders. When you measure to the top of his head, it comes out to more like 18 millimeter, and that would be where that heavy black line is. If he was standing up straight, he'd probably be closer to 20 millimeter. So 15 millimeter, not so much. And you could say, and you would be right to say, that hey, not all humans are the same size. But I did the math here, and let's say your average 15 millimeter man was 6 feet tall. Well, these guys would be 7 feet tall, and since they're not Spartans, that doesn't make any sense at all. So yeah, I would go with these guys being 18 millimeter and not 15 millimeter, as has been said. I could be wrong. Maybe they changed their minds at some point and said, no, these guys are all going to be 18 millimeter, but I never heard that. I heard that this was a 15 millimeter game. So, just food for thought. Moving on. As if I needed another reason to be unhappy today, do you notice anything missing? You know, maybe something that should be here. Yeah, it's missing a wing. I just started sorting through all the parts to make sure that, you know, everything was going to go together. And unfortunately, that one seems to be missing. So, yeah, just something else I need to deal with. Oh, you know what? As long as I'm talking about these parts as well. In the last set of these I did, I assumed that since I only got one clear acrylic piece that I was missing 2, and then I noticed this one only had 1 as well, but it also had 2 marks to I guess point out where you need to cut this, you know, with your clipper in order to get 3 parts out of that. So that wasn't missing. But yeah, that is, went through the bags, went through everything. Really all I do is when I get a bag of parts, I just dump them out right on here so that I can take a look and make sure that everything is where it should be. And I thought maybe it just got mixed up with some of the other things that I had pulled out for the beginning of this video, but no such luck. So there's that. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to use some sandy paste. This is Vallejo's sandy paste for filling in around the base supports. And I just apply it with a brush. Here. And it's really easy to put in there, and it doesn't really shrink because it's really just paint. It's like a gray paint with pumice in it, and the pumice can't shrink, so I'm essentially just filling that area with pumice. And when it dries, it'll look like sand. And since it's so fine, it'll scale nicely with the minis. So there's a couple I've already done. And I just put the stuff out on my wet palette so that I have it handy and it's not drying out the big tub, leaving the tub open. But yeah, you can just get it in there and then smooth it out and then add a little bit, you know, around other parts of the base so it doesn't look so focused on just those areas. And there you go. So I'll be back in a bit. So I've got everything prepped, mostly. Here's the weird thing. So I've been using Mr. Metal Primer, and this represents a stand of infantry, okay, an elite and 2 grunts, that have been fully coated with Mr. Metal Primer. As you can see, it is completely transparent, and I found that to be rather strange. And I seem to recall hearing that that was the case with this stuff from Mr. Hobby. And the stuff smells like it'll kill you if you use it in an enclosed space, so don't do that. I did it outside and it still felt like there was this cloud of noxious vapor settling around me, so yeah, just be really careful with this stuff. But that'll be interesting. I guess this is sort of just a prep coat. I'm not sure exactly what it's supposed to do. I tried reading the instructions. And these don't have the primer on it, so yeah, they're gonna get another coat of primer because I need to have my color coat to work from. So that'll be airbrush, and that'll be tomorrow, and I think maybe we'll talk about that more tomorrow. So that's going to do it for now. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.